And that sounds like a cliche, it sounds like a bromide, but if you listen to the Johnson tapes, you come away with this unmistakable sense of personal tragedy, because Johnson is debating with himself his own rationale for the war in Vietnam. You get a sense over and over again that he doesn't believe what he's saying to the American people. And that, it seems to me, ultimately communicated itself to the American people. And I don't think we've ever recovered. Obviously, Watergate exacerbated that sense of distrust. Iran-Contra. There are many people who believe the current war in Iraq. It's interesting how much of this pertains to foreign policy. The Iran-Contra, of course, with Ronald Reagan is a classic example. There are wonderful stories about the efforts that those around the president made to bring him around to the viewpoint that, yes, maybe you did trade arms for hostages. I got to know President Reagan in his later years, and I heard him talk about Iran-Contra, and I can guarantee you, to the day he died, he was utterly convinced that he never intended or even accidentally was involved in the business of trading hostages for arms. And likewise, in terms of the law breaking that went on with providing arms to Nicaragua and to the Contras, almost everyone else disagrees. But maybe that's what makes Reagan a leader, because he could see things. Reagan had an extraordinary capacity to convince himself. And I don't mean that as critically as it sounds, because if you can't convince yourself, how are you going to convince other people? And Reagan, as we all know, was known as the great communicator. But I think he communicated those things first to himself. And there's a White House speechwriter, name escapes me at the moment, but who was Landon Pervin is his name, and he was brought in and given the unenviable task of writing a speech in which the president would, in effect, apologize for misleading the American people without ever saying he had misled the American people. And that's called threading the needle. And they had to find exactly the right verbal formula with which Reagan was comfortable. And you may remember it. It's been borrowed many times, too many times since. Reagan said, and I don't know the exact words, but to the effect that, in my heart, I knew that we didn't do anything wrong. However, in my head, I can see how some people might conclude that we had done things wrong. And of course, the all-purpose mistakes were made. But he got through it. And he got through it because Ronald Reagan had established, with a critical mass of the American people, a reputation as a truth teller. Not just a charismatic seller of policies, but someone who they believed was authentic. Great irony, the only professional actor ever to be president. No wonder he said that he had concluded that you couldn't do this job if you weren't a bit of an actor. Iraq, maybe we'll get to that I have a hunch we might get to that afterwards. Then there's Richard Nixon, who made lying into an art form. Richard Nixon said to Len Gurman, his law partner in New York once, Len, you'll never make a good candidate, you don't know how to lie. And you know what? I don't know whether he was joking or not. Richard Nixon, there's a wonderful scene in Lawrence of Arabia. How many of you seen Lawrence of Arabia? Well, it's the thinking man's epic, one of the last ones made. And wonderful movie. And there's this marvelous character, worldly, urbane, cynical, a great diplomat, and a very skilled liar, played by Claude Rains. And he has a wonderful line that I always thought applied uniquely to the Nixon administration. He distinguished between a man who tells a lie and a man who tells a half lie. He said a man who tells a lie has hidden the truth. A man who tells a half lie has forgotten where he put it. Isn't that a great line? And I think Richard Nixon believed virtually everything he said throughout Watergate. I think he had to, but I think he did, right up until the end. But I think he was like the man who had forgotten where he put the truth. The irony is, he was a terrible liar. Remember? I mean, watching him, I mean, he'd sweat and he'd be visibly uncomfortable, and you thought, Hannah Nixon was there in the Oval Office looking over her son's shoulder, reminding him as a good Quaker, this is wrong. And it's part of what contributes to this extraordinary psychological, nuance of Richard Nixon, because I think he found himself in a position where the Cold War, you may disagree with me about this, maybe we could talk about it. It seems to me the Cold War had a long-term corrosive effect in many ways. When you're in a fight, a life and death fight for survival, it is not surprising that you find it possible over time, easy, to justify whatever is necessary. Ends and means take on a whole different dimension. And I think that includes, in some cases, telling the truth or being completely accurate. I mean, for example, when you think of Dwight Eisenhower and in May of 1960, when the U-2 plane, I mean, this is, talk about disappointment for Ike. In his last year in office, he desperately wanted to do something significant to turn the heat down in the Cold War, and to leave office not only as the man who won World War II, but a man who had really definitively turned the corner on the Cold War, the superpower rivalry with the Soviet Union. At the same time, remember, this was the president who had used the CIA in covert ways to overthrow, quote, hostile governments in places like Guatemala and Iran, and who 2 weeks before the critical summit meeting of the Western powers that was going to take place in Paris under the General de Gaulle's chairmanship, 2 weeks before that, he agreed to one final overflight of a spy plane, a U-2 plane, over the Soviet Union. And he had been assured by the CIA that a pilot, if they were ever able, with one lucky shot, to hit this thing, which of course, remember, the U-2s flew at very, very high altitudes. If they ever managed to bring this thing down, there's no way in the world that the pilot would survive. Well, Nikita Khrushchev announced one day out of the blue that they had shot down a U-2 plane over the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower, uncharacteristically, in many ways uncharacteristically, denied it. And then, of course, Khrushchev sprung his trap. They had the pilot. Gary Francis Powers had survived against all odds and all the expertise that the CIA could bring to muster. And it was, needless to say, a very large dish of crow that Eisenhower was forced to consume. But he did it manfully. He refused to apologize, as demanded by the Russians. He made it very clear that both sides were spying on each other, that was a necessity in the Cold War, that you had no choice. I mean, in the real world, you had no choice but to do this.